That was me doing slow motion. And speaking of slow motion, I'm a big fan of it. I mean, really, who isn't a huge fan? Everything just looks way cooler in slow motion. And so for that reason, I reached out to Freefly Systems to check out their new camera, the Wave, which shoots up to 4K 422 frames per second. It's insane. And the kind folks at Freefly Systems were nice enough to send out a camera for me to test out. Now, Freefly Systems is more known for their drones and their gimbals. I actually had one of the first gimbals that they put out, the Movi M5, and I kind of fell in love with their brand ever since. And with most of my gear reviews here on this channel, I want to keep it short and sweet and do just a little pros and cons. Again, just to give you a better understanding to see whether or not this would be something that you'd want to check out. But before those pros and cons, let's look at the specs. So the Wave shoots on a Super 35 sensor, shooting slow-mo up to 4K 422 frames per second or 2K at 1461 frames per second. Has a 2 terabyte internal storage, which means you can shoot roughly up to 35 minutes. And that's kind of one of the craziest specs. You can shoot until you run out of storage. And it's also pretty compact and lightweight at 716 grams. The battery lasts for about an hour and a half. And lastly, it has an E-mount for all you Sony shooters, but with a simple adapter, you're good to go on whatever lens that you have. So with those quick specs, let's jump into the pros and the cons, starting with the pros. And that's obviously got to be that 4K 422 frames per second. And to be honest, the 4K looks great. Shooting at that resolution and that frame rate is incredible. You really get to slow things down and be able to see just those small incremental movements. And for me, because I love slow-mo so much, it's awesome. Another pro that I kind of briefly mentioned in the specs is that unlimited record time. So with the Wave, you're only limited by the storage. So if you want to fill up 2 terabytes with one really long clip, you can do that. Most other cameras only have like a 5-second, 8-second, 10-second little burst that you're able to capture your slow motion with. Not with the Wave. You can go as long as you want until you run out of storage. And so that was a huge pro for me. As with anything in video, sometimes there's just these little things that what would be the end of your clip that you're able to capture, and same thing with the slow-mo. Sometimes you just want to be able to run just a little bit longer than usual because you might capture something that you never even intended to. And when it came to actually shooting and using the camera, this was another pro. It's super easy to use. There's hardly any buttons, which makes it very simple to use. And I don't mean simple in a negative way. I mean simple as in it's easy to use. It's great. It's a pro. It doesn't get complicated. And even with their menu systems, with other cameras, menu systems can get really complicated and confusing. Not with the Wave. With the Wave, it was super easy to navigate through, and everything was honestly just really intuitive. I didn't look at the instruction manual, didn't really read up too much. I was able to just take the camera, go out and start shooting. Even when I was exporting and importing into my computer, all the software that I had to install was super easy to use to be able to take the video from the camera onto my computer and be able to export that into Premiere. But I guess you can also consider that a con because there's that kind of middleman software that you've got to go through. You can't just take the clips that are on the camera and import that straight into Premiere. You got to go through Freefly's software first. And another pro that's kind of related to that ease of shooting, because the camera was built really compact and light, that made shooting a lot easier as well. It's something I could just toss into my camera bag whenever I wanted, didn't take up too much space. And being as light as it is, I could even do some handheld shots and it wasn't a burden at all. Now the last pro maybe could also be a con, and that's the price. We got to talk about the price. It comes in at just under $11,000. Now, for some people that's automatically like way out of your budget. $11,000 is a lot of money. But when it comes to what this camera can offer, but also the fact that a lot of slow motion cameras are way more than 10 times that price, this could be a bargain for the quality or the capabilities that this camera offers. Instead of paying $250,000 for a Phantom Flex and not being able to buy a house, maybe you want to opt for this. And so with that semi-hefty price tag, that brings us to some of the cons. Now, the biggest con that I ran into had to be the dynamic range. So when shooting in a situation where you've got bright highlights and dark shadows, this is where the camera, I think, could be improved and struggled a little bit. When the lighting was right, when the lighting was nice and even and soft, the camera did amazing. So I think when you're able to get the right lighting conditions, or if you're shooting in a studio where you're able to control absolutely everything, I think this camera shines. It does great. But in certain outdoor situations where even, something like shooting on my R5, where I'm able to bring down my highlights or bring up my shadows in post, I just wasn't able to have that kind of flexibility in post, or just straight out of the camera where highlights that I wouldn't have normally thought would be blown out were blown out. So I think the next con that I discovered was that when shooting in 2K, for whatever reason, the quality just seemed to drop. Now, I don't really know why this is the case or what it is that causes it, but there's really a noticeable difference between the 4K and the 2K. So I would say if you're going to be shooting in the 2K, that would probably only be usable for social media. Sometimes it looked okay, but for the most part, I would recommend shooting in the 4K. So the last con for me was the time it took to actually export or import the files from the camera to my computer. So the cable that I was given was a USB-C to USB. And so maybe that was the reason it took forever, that USB side of things just maybe slowed things down. But for me, it really took a long time. It took like a couple hours for me to import all the files. Now, I was importing a ton of data onto my computer. And obviously with slow motion, like the files are gonna be pretty dang big, especially when you're shooting at 4K, 422 frames per second. So the file size plus the time that it took to get there, to get onto my computer, was definitely a con. This isn't just like you shoot and you're editing, within a couple minutes. It took a while to import that all onto my computer. But to wrap kind of everything up, I absolutely loved using this camera. I loved the image that I got out of it, the different shots that I was able to get. There's shots that I got on this that I would never be able to get on any other camera. It was incredible. And so I really loved shooting on the Wave. The question obviously comes up, who is this camera for? Is this camera for you? Would I recommend you buying it? And that would be a yes and a no. If you're somebody that needs slow motion, somebody that needs it for, inside the studio, or maybe you're doing sports, I think this is a great option. If you're somebody that doesn't shoot a lot of slow-mo or just uses it occasionally, I don't think I'd recommend this for you. Obviously, I mean, $11,000 to occasionally shoot some slow-mo, unless you just got the cash to spend and you want to do it, awesome. But I mean, for the average person, it's probably not the camera for you. But if you need that slow motion for sports or for, in studio commercials, this is great. I can really see a lot of really cool applications and ways that you'd be able to capitalize on this camera. So that being said, if you've used it, or if you'd want to use it, or if you wouldn't want to use it. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to get your feedback. If you've got any questions, if I missed something that you want to know, let me know in the comments below. And as always, if you haven't already, make sure to like and subscribe. It really does help and make a difference. And I'll see you in the next video. Okay. Please tell me I was recording.